We are recording this webcast, and if everybody on the line could mute themselves until they do want to ask a question, will help with the recording quality. But we do want to take a roll call of who is participating. So we'll start here in this room here at the Community Foundation. My name is Cameron Tana of Montgomery Associates, a consultant to the Mid-County Groundwater Agency.
Hi, this is Tim Carson with the Regional Water Management Foundation.
John Ricker, County of Santa Cruz.
Dana McCarthy, Water Utility Ratepayer for the MGA.
Marco Romini, Central Water District Representative.
Keith Gudger at large.
Kate Anderson, Environmental Representative on the Advisory Committee.
Robert Schultz, alternate for the Tidal Well Owners MGA.
Darcy Pruitt with the Regional Water Management Foundation.
Tom Ledoux with the MGA and also Soquel Creek Water District.
Ralph Racamani, Central Water District.
Jim Kerr, MGA Board.
Becky Steinbrunner, resident of Aptos.
Maria Steinbruner, also resident of Aptos.
Hello, welcome. We're just introducing ourselves. Could you introduce yourself?
Debbie Tong.
Thank you. And people who have joined us online, if you could state your name.
Hello, I am Andretti Clavica, Doha Fisheries, Santa Rosa.
Georgina King from Hydrometric. Sorry, not Hydrometric, from Montgomery Associates.
Executive Council from Jersey West.
Titi Buka from the West. Theo Ryan from the County of Santa Cruz. Sarah Hackerty from Environmental.
I also see that
There's also Bruce Daniels on the line. He just sent a message to say he didn't have a microphone, but he is also listening in.
and I did see that Carla Christensen was online earlier, but I don't see her now. And we will have chances to ask questions at specific points during the session. So if you could mute your line until we get to that point. So thank you for how a model works, the role for the model in a groundwater sustainability plan, and we'll get into some of the details of the model, including the model construction and inputs, what we did to calibrate the model, some of the main outputs of the model, including the model water budget. Then we'll just get into how the model is being used for the GSP for Mid-County Basin, and that includes describing the baseline assumptions for model simulations and how we then evaluate the results from those model simulations. And so after each of these sections, and some of the earlier ones are shorter than the later ones, especially the ones in the middle, we will pause to ask if there are any clarifying questions and answer your questions at those points. We want to be able to get through these sections and try to get through the material and hit all these objectives in our 2 hours here. So first purpose of groundwater modeling. The general purpose is to get an idea of how the groundwater system works and how that groundwater system behaves under different conditions. And so we wanted to be able to use the model to see what results from changes to inputs that might affect the groundwater system. And the idea is to build a better understanding of the relationship between natural systems and human activities, and understanding how that relationship and how things work together will help us make better management decisions about how human activities affect the basin. So any questions to start with here?
Can we dim the light?
We can go.
Yeah, they get that. I think.
So we're going to just try to dim the lights, have people here in the room see the screen a little better.
Sorry, I don't live in this room very often.
Hopefully that's not the best thing I do today.
We're turning up positive.
All right, so how groundwater model works in general. So it's important to recognize that it's a simplification of a very complex natural world, and it tries to take into account all the important components of the natural system, of what happens at the surface, what happens in the subsurface, in the groundwater aquifer system, and tries to simulate the water cycle, how water moves through those different systems. What does the model do? It calculates water budgets, and it basically takes the inflows and the outflows and does a mass balance of them and calculates the change in groundwater and storage. And that change of groundwater and storage equates to the change in groundwater levels. So if you have more inflows than outflows, groundwater and storage increases and groundwater levels rise. If you have more outflows than inflows, you have groundwater in storage decreasing and groundwater levels drop. So take another quick break. These kind of super short sections here to start with. Any questions on that? So model role in groundwater sustainability and groundwater sustainability plans. The Department of California Department of Water Resources Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations discuss how a groundwater model can be used and is recommended to use for GSPs. It's not required to use. There are ways to write a GSP without a groundwater model, but it's clear from the regulations that the use of a numerical model is recommended. So role in groundwater management in general, groundwater management is complex because there are constantly changing conditions, changes in human activities, changes in climate, changes in attempts to manage the groundwater system can all be occurring at the same time. And so a model, it tends to be a tool that can evaluate those changing conditions and to represent the different hydrologic processes in doing that. And so a groundwater flow model can simulate and predict the movement and use of water. So there are three sections in the GSP where a model is used. The first is section 2, the plan area and basin setting, and it's mostly about the basin water budget. There's a requirement for historical and current groundwater budgets, and use a model to help with that. And the main place where the model can help is you have inputs which you can describe as groundwater recharge and groundwater pumping without a model. But the model does help calculate this change of groundwater in storage. How does groundwater levels change over time? And then with the future groundwater budget, this is where the plan is evaluated for how well it achieves sustainability. And because you evaluate sustainability with your future modeling, you're modeling the future conditions, you can get a water budget that represents sustainability. And if you have a water budget that represents sustainability, you can estimate a sustainable yield from that water budget. So how much, generally sustainable yield is thought of as how much pumping can occur and be sustainable. And because the future budget helps guide you to what is sustainable, that's where you evaluate sustainable yield. The future groundwater budget also needs to include the effects of climate change, and we will discuss that in more detail later in the session. So section 3 is sustainable management criteria. The GSP advisory committee has spent a lot of time on developing sustainable management criteria, and is still ongoing. And so one thing the model can do is just evaluate whether achieving minimum thresholds that define undesirable results and therefore define what's sustainable, whether that's achievable with under the plan. And so this is where a lot of what we recommended and proposed to the committee has been groundwater level proxies for sustainable management criteria, even if they're not specifically groundwater level related. So seawater intrusion is the main one, but also depletion of interconnected surface waters. We try to translate everything into groundwater level proxies because the model outputs groundwater levels, and you can compare the groundwater levels in the model to those sustainable management criteria. The model can also inform the measurable objectives, which are supposed to provide operational flexibility above the minimum thresholds. And so by simulating operations, you can see how much operational flexibility is required to stay above a minimum threshold. And the model can also help with developing interim milestones by saying, well, based off of this plan, and the model shows that we should expect the progress towards sustainability to look like that, like the model results. And those model results can guide these interim milestones by saying, are we keeping track with what we expected from what the model said we should expect? And that can guide you at these 5-year milestone points. How far along towards sustainability should you be, or if you're falling short, then maybe something else, you have to do something else that the model didn't originally predict. Section 4, this is specifically evaluating projects and management actions to achieve the sustainability goal. As described in Section 3, that will be compared to sustainability management criteria. By this, where you could compare projects and actions and see how it achieves sustainability within the goal of 20 years and how it maintains sustainability over the following 30 years, but also allows you to compare different projects and actions. So you can use the model to simulate different projects and actions and compare the results from the model of those different projects and actions. You also assess about what areas benefit from different projects and actions, and therefore who benefits from those different projects and actions. So any question about how the model fits into the GSPs? Okay. Now that is all review of what has been presented to the advisory committee, but I think it is worth laying the groundwork for getting into more of the details of the model itself. And the model is It is a complex model, so this is a much longer section about how the model is constructed and what inputs go into the model. And so for model process, we basically have 3 different steps. First, you have the input to the model, different variables that you can estimate outside of the model. You provide that to the model, which represents the natural system with different mathematical equations that represent groundwater flow processes. And then you get out of that a combination of the input into the model simulating the natural system and output, which is groundwater levels and water budget. So we'll start with the input, the model structure, inflows and outflows, and model boundaries. So here's the model domain. The model domain is bigger than the Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin. The Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin is this blue area. And the model domain covers a larger area, including adjacent basins or parts of adjacent basins, including Santa Margarita, the Purisima Highlands subbasin, and the Paro Valley subbasin, and an area that isn't considered groundwater basin by the Department of Water Resources. So the inland area covers is the watershed that provides water to the basin. So precipitation that falls on this watershed is potential recharge to the groundwater that could eventually flow into the Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin. So the model domain goes up to the ridge line, which defines the watershed inland, and the western boundary is based off of outcrops of aquifer units that make up the Santa Cruz Mid-County Basin. And we include part of the Paro Valley subbasin to include the stream gauge where water flows out of the watershed. And we also go offshore because the interchange between the flows offshore from the basin and onshore from outcrops connected to the bay is important for evaluating seawater intrusion. So model input flow data include inflows and outflows. Inflows include what recharges the groundwater basin. But in our model, the model actually calculates the recharge from precipitation. So our model actually takes precipitation as the direct input, and the model calculates how much water then percolates into groundwater. Other inflows include return flows from water use, return flow from irrigation, water that's applied for growing plants that makes it down into the groundwater system, and also return flow from leaking systems such as sewer and water transmission infrastructure and septic systems. Inflow input data can also include managed aquifer recharge, purposeful taking of water supplies and trying to recharge either through wells, ponds, or other surface water features. Outflows that are include evapotranspiration, but here our model calculates evapotranspiration, so we provide temperature as an input data to this model. Another main outflow is well pumping, some of which is based off of recorded data, and some of it which is, in our case, estimated for private, institutional, and agricultural pumping. So these inputs and outputs, some of these input data and some of these output data, we have recorded data to use as inputs. So rainfall, temperature, municipal pumping, we have recorded data. Other inputs and outputs, we have to estimate the inputs and outputs, including the return flow, how much of the water gets back to the groundwater system, and some of the well pumping where we don't have recorded data. The model takes the inflows and outflows and calculates subsurface flows into and out of the basin or the model domain. It also will calculate how much comes in from offshore, and then calculates water level changes, which is also change in groundwater and storage. So as I described some of the inputs and outputs are estimates, and it's difficult to estimate all those inputs accurately. So many assumptions are made for the model, and those are documented in the model calibration report that we have drafted. So just a couple of inputs include the pumping and return flow. And so pumping includes the municipal pumping, which are these yellowish orange bars. They're stacked bars of pumping in acre-feet per year for our calibration period, our historical period that we simulate to evaluate how the model performs against observed data of 1985 to 2015. We have records for municipal pumping over time, and we enter that monthly, and these are the annual summaries of those data. But for other types of pumping, we needed to estimate it based off of land use. And that includes estimating private domestic pumping within the basin, which is these blue bars, institutional pumping, which are parks, typically, some camps and golf courses are included in this. So there's mostly irrigation, but not ag. That's kind of larger scale irrigation, but it's not agriculture. And this is within the basin, and then the pink is agriculture within the basin. Remember we have the model cover outside the basin, so we have to estimate pumping outside of the basin as well. There isn't municipal pumping outside the basin within our model domain that we're simulating. But we do estimate the domestic pumping, institutional pumping, and ag pumping outside of the basin. And those amounts are greater outside of the basin than within the basin. We have those water use estimates, but some of the water that's used for those purposes, all purposes, municipal, irrigation, agricultural, institutional irrigation, agricultural, private, domestic, they do potentially return to the groundwater system as return flow. So we do calculate some estimates of how much return flow occurs. And it's based off of the different kinds of water use, how much we estimate is used indoors, and then how that wastewater is treated. So if it's in the municipal supply, some of that indoor water use, some of it goes to sewer, some of it goes to septic, and the sewer has some return flow and the septic has more return flow. We estimate how much ends up as outdoor water use, and that's treated as irrigation, and there's an estimate of how much return flow comes from irrigation based off of estimating irrigation efficiency of 90%. So 10% returns to the groundwater system. And so of the water use we had before, this is the amount of return flow that we estimate for the very same categories that we estimate for pumping. So municipal within the basin, private, institutional, and agriculture within the basin, and then the non-municipal use outside the basin. And these are inputs that we provide to the model, but they don't necessarily counteract each other directly, because the pumping occurs from deeper aquifers while the return flow occurs closer to the surface. So any questions about model constructions and inputs and outputs?
Are the two scales the same?
The two scales, I think, were the same.
Yeah.
They're meant to be the same.
What does HRU stand for?
Excuse me?
HRU.
Oh, HRU. HRU. So HRU is a hydrologic response unit. So that's a term for the watershed model. where the watershed model calculation is done for each of these hydrologic response units. And for our model, the hydrologic response units are uniformly 800 feet by 800 feet. And so they correspond to all of our subsurface model cells as well. So our model is on a grid of 800 feet by 800 feet cells, or hydrologic response units.
Excuse me. So
Hello.
on one of the inputs, precipitation, is that total amount, or do you consider pattern of precipitation as well?
Yeah, so the precipitation is provided as daily precipitation at stations, at weather stations in the model domain.
Okay.
Jared? And I'll go down to Alexandres. Jared?
Sorry, I was late, so if this question got asked earlier, just skip it, please. What is the pumping capacity out of the aquifer?
So,
Like your Santa Cruz Mud's water and the potable intertie is big enough, how much can be pumped?
so we'll cover how we answer that question, but part of it is defining what is sustainable for the basin and evaluating the future water budget for what that sustainable, how much pumping can be achieved under different projects and management actions to achieve that sustainability, and that can help answer the question. But we can't answer that question specifically for a GSP until we run those future simulations.
So if I understand your answer correctly, you're putting a limit on the pumping capacity that has to do with sustainability, not Chairman Mao or 2 steps forward, 1 step back sustainability, but that you've got a sustainability level that's fixed and you never want to exceed that.
Right, so the sustainability is defined as preventing undesirable results under 6 sustainability indicators. The main one here is seawater intrusion. And so, for example, for seawater intrusion, the advisory committee is considering groundwater level proxies that will prevent seawater intrusion over the long term. And so the idea is, what will it take to achieve those groundwater levels over the long term? And that can inform how much pumping can occur. But it could be different depending on how you go about what you implement to raise those groundwater levels.
But the short answer is we don't have an answer to your question yet. So be patient.
Well,
Keep moving there.
I just want to understand I want to make sure that extra unneeded constraints aren't being put upon.
Right. We haven't even gotten there yet, Jerry. We're just talking about how the system works at this point.
But there will be constraints, yes. Yeah. And that constraints are based on how the MGA defines sustainability. And so Andres, I think, wanted to ask a question, and then we go to
Yes, thank you. It's kind of unclear for me if 800 feet grid resolution will be optimal to characterize the hydrologic process in the basin.
Yeah, so we did evaluate grid size based off of, mostly based off of elevation changes in the basin to represent the watershed processes. And I can follow up with you on the details
Okay.
of that if you're interested.
Yeah, I'm only, worried about, when I saw your previous presentation with the GS flow, it wasn't clear if 800 feet can characterize water interaction with the stream, That's not my question.
Yeah, that's certainly a limitation. We're trying to balance what it takes to represent the elevation changes in the watershed, and therefore how flow runs off the surface with model run times. so that we can to calibrate the model and use it for future simulations.
Okay, thank you.
I think Becky.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
With the septic systems, I'm trying to remember, is UZF right into the upper soil zone, or is that a little deeper?
It goes, the way we've applied it, and there are options, but the way we've applied it is to the first saturated groundwater in the system. But that is generally in the shallowest layer. So it does get applied to the shallowest layer.
So you're sort of bypassing.
We do bypass the Veda zone.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Becky Steinbrunner. What informational sources do you use to try to support your estimates, and how do you coordinate that in the model with geology and the differences in geology over the area?
So for estimates like water use, we do look at previous documentation estimates of how much water use is returned to the system. There are estimates from the EPA that we've looked at. And so there is a wide range of possible estimates, so it is important to test the sensitivity of those estimates, and we've done some of that. And it isn't, and those return flow estimates are not that sensitive to how the system is simulated. As far as geology is concerned, we look at previous documentation of the geologic conceptual model based off of data collected from wells that identify these different aquifer units in the basin and represent that that information in the model. But because the model covers a big area and the data come from specific points, there are estimates of how the information from the specific wells should be extrapolated to the whole model area. But we try to do that by looking at the relationship, the spatial relationship between the information at the wells.
And you do actual calibrations in certain areas to test your estimate?
Yeah, so we'll get into calibration.
Okay. Thank you.
In, I think the next section.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sorry.
On the boundary map, how far offshore was that gray line?
It's about a mile.
About a mile?
Yes. Any other questions? Thank you. Yeah, model calibration.
There we go.
So the next step in the model process is where the model simulates groundwater flow based off of the input. And the model software, the model code, basically includes the mathematical equations that represent groundwater flow. And so there are a lot of variables that go into those groundwater flow equations. And we need to provide values for those variables so that the system, so the model represents the natural system as has been observed. And so calibration is the process of providing values for those variables and seeing the results of the model and seeing if they represent the observed results and trying to have them represent as best as possible. And sometimes as you're doing that, you do actually see that there's some things in your conceptual model that don't make sense when the model is not simulating the observations that are available, and then make adjustments to set up for the model. So, over the last couple of years, we have gone back and changed some of the model setup, not just the values that are entering the model to represent that. So GS Flow is an integrated watershed groundwater model developed by the U.S. Geological Survey. It combines basically a watershed model called PRMS, for Precipitation Runoff Modeling System, that simulates the surface system, the watershed system. So basically, it simulates climate, how precipitation lands on the surface and evaporates from the surface and evapotranspirates from plants on the surface, and then how much can become groundwater recharge. Then that groundwater recharge is added to model code that represents groundwater flow, which is mod flow, which is also a U.S. Geological Survey code. And both the surface system via surface runoff and near surface interflow can add flow to the streams. And groundwater can also add flow to streams and also receive water from the streams. So we have three different regions: surface, streams, and groundwater. And this figure shows a little bit more about what GS Flow is doing at the surface, where it takes precipitation and air temperature as inputs to the model to calculate how much runs off via the surface, how much is near surface interflow, and then how much can become groundwater recharge. And then ModFlow does the groundwater, and then this SFR package of ModFlow does the stream flow calculations. So model calibration is the process of adjusting the model parameters, basically the values that inform the equations that represent groundwater flow, so that the model outputs approximate historical observations. And that approximation provides a basis to project future basin management conditions with the model. So the first piece of the GS Flow input is climate input. Climate input includes daily precipitation, minimum and maximum temperature, and from that, GS Flow calculates evapotranspiration, stream flow, and groundwater recharge. So the precipitation is the source of water, the temperature provides information about how much of that water leaves the surface via evaporation and evapotranspiration. And PRMS, the watershed modeling, calculates where the water goes from there. And so that does require a calibration of the climate output. We do input climate at specific stations in our model, and these are stations where we have data to input. So we input rainfall at the Santa Cruz Co-op station, as well as rainfall at the Watsonville Waterworks Treatment Plant Station. This is outside the model domain, but informs how much rainfall occurs in this area of the basin. On this side of this blue line, the purple line is the basin itself. And we also use a data set to provide information about what temperature is at the upper ocean. We actually show two other stations here where we have data for evapotranspiration and solar radiation, which we calibrate to. We are getting some shuffling of papers from online. If you could mute your line, I'd appreciate it. And so given the input of rainfall and temperature, we calibrate to the data that we have for solar radiation and potential evapotranspiration. So we are representing the system for climate appropriately. And basically we compare monthly average data at these stations for these parameters to match the observed data, which is the solid line, versus the dashed model results for simulated monthly averages. And try to match that as closely as possible to represent the system. Our solar radiation is basically one value over the whole domain. So at one station during the summertime, we overpredict solar radiation. Another one we underpredicted. It was basically to reduce how much the mismatch is between the two stations. And similar idea for potential vapor transpiration. So once we do that, we calibrate watershed parameters. Basically, calibrated water parameters based off of different zones in the watershed. We define the zones based off of what was upstream of the basin and the Zayani Fault, and had the zones where we have stream gauge data to calibrate to, because we're basically calibrating the watershed parameters to stream flow, to adjust the parameters that represent the surface system so that the stream flow we observe at the stream gauge matches the simulated output from the model. And so have stream gauges along Soquel Creek, so have a zone that represents Soquel Creek and adjacent sub-watersheds that aren't gauged. Have gauges along Atlas Creek, and Atlas Creek is Valencia Creek, so we treat that separately, and then gauges in the Corralitos Creek system. And there's some of these watersheds that we don't have gauges, and we group it with the adjacent watersheds with gauges. And so for calibrating stream flow for this system, we found that we needed to match what was observed as pretty slow recession curves over the springtime and summer. And I'll show an example of that in the next slide. And so that meant that to calibrate this model to those results, we needed to have relatively high soil capacities in the system for the basin as a whole. And that meant there were low values for how the soil values will least flow to the stream flows. So the soils kind of hold the flow over several months and release it slowly over the summer. And for most of the system to simulate what we're observing with these slow recession curves, we would need relatively low stream bed conductivity. But there are limited areas where shallow groundwater level data are available. And so there are definitely possibilities where certain areas there could be a greater connection between groundwater and the streams than what we're simulating. But as a whole, to get the water balance of the basin matching the stream flows that we're observing, less than 1 cubic foot per second with our model. And so this is a comparison of observed data in stream flows on a logarithmic scale against simulated stream flow, where this 45-degree line indicates the best fit between observations and simulations. And in Soquel Creek, we're following that line, but you can see at the lower stream flows, we do not simulate the lower stream flows. Again, in Corralitos Creek, we're generally following the line, but there's a lot more scatter in that area outside of the basin. That's the stream flow calibration, and where we've calibrated the stream flow, what is remaining is groundwater recharge. Then we basically try to calibrate the groundwater system to groundwater level data using the recharge that comes out of the stream flow calibration. And so we have groundwater level data at that are taken at groundwater level targets or groundwater level wells, or monitoring wells or production wells where groundwater level data have been collected. And these are the wells we use at different aquifers and model layers we have in the model. And you can see there's some large areas of the model where we do not have groundwater level data. Outside the basin, we basically don't have groundwater level data. In the inland area, inland of what we simulated as a fault in the middle of the basin, because we see evidence of a restriction on groundwater flow across this area, as well as documentation of some potential faulting in this area. We don't have a lot of groundwater level data in those inland areas as well. And so we're really relying on where we have groundwater level data. And it's also to be noted that not all of these groundwater level targets are equivalent in how much data they have and what time span they cover. And so there's a number of parts to the groundwater system that we are calibrating. Hydraulic conductivity parameters, which represent how the aquifer systems transmit flow, either horizontally or vertically. Storage parameters, which provide a relationship for the change in storage and that comes out of the inflows minus outflows water budget and how much groundwater levels change. And then how the boundaries are represented. How do the boundaries transmit flow, either from offshore, seafloor, and the Santa Margarita Basin and southeast boundaries. We also have values for how the faults transmit flow across the fault. So we're changing all these values to try to match the simulated values. Here, the green line at this one example well, and this is pretty much as good as it gets. There are other wells where it's not nearly as good as this. To the observations, these blue dots. And look at the overall model where we're evaluating observed groundwater elevations versus simulated groundwater elevations and see how it fits along the 45-degree line. You see there are wells where it's not calibrated, but for the most part it's following along that line. And so it's also important to recognize where you are calibrated and where you're less calibrated, and that helps inform what the model can be used for. And so the model results as a whole do provide groundwater levels throughout the basin. And so through each aquifer layer, we have groundwater levels, where here the blue colors are the higher groundwater levels, going down to the darker orange, which are the lower groundwater levels. You can see the direction of flow based off of that. You can see where the municipal pumping generally occurs and generally in these aquifer units, which have the greatest drawdown in these layers and aquifer units, and flow going towards those darker orange colors, where the groundwater level is pumped from. Groundwater levels are lower and because of the pumping in each of these layers. So this is what the model produces as a result, and for each time period, you get these results and calibrate to observations along the time span. Most recently, we have done some more calibration of shallow groundwater levels along the creek, specifically Soquel Creek, where we do have shallow groundwater level data. And here, we revisit the fact that we have cells that are 800 feet wide, and we are underlying the streams with basically alluvium, subsurface cells representing alluvium that are 800 feet wide. We are getting some static again. If somebody unmuted recently, please mute. Continues to help. So we're calibrating shallow groundwater levels in these 800 feet wide cells that underline the streams. And so that means what the model simulates, basically at the streams, are the streams, the overlying the alluvium, and in Soquel Creek, that overlies outcropping aquifer unit, which is the Persona A unit, and that overlies Persona double A in the TU. So at the Main Street well location, there are several monitoring wells, several wells that are shallow, that are different distances from Soquel Creek. And then there, which are these three wells here. And then there are some deeper monitoring wells and the Main Street production well. But the model does not simulate this transverse flow from the creek towards the Main Street production well. We can only evaluate what the model says directly underneath the creek and try to represent what we observed in the shallow groundwater levels in what's directly below the stream. And so at Main Street well, we're trying to simulate the observed groundwater level data. And the idea, because of those limitations, is to simulate the long-term trend that we're observing. And the long-term trend does show a connection between the deeper aquifer unit and the shallow groundwater level at that location. It's very muted. The Main Street pumping occurs in the AA and the underlying TU unit, and it does result in many larger changes in groundwater levels. Then as you go to the shallow A unit, we simulated a muted response, and then in the shallow groundwater levels, it's muted as well, and we're able to simulate the trend over time. Not all of the changes in the shorter term, but we're able to simulate the long-term reduction in pumping in the aquifer unit and specifically the Main Street well, and the more recent changes where Main Street increased pumping and then decreased at the very end of the model run. So what are the uses of, based off the calibration, important to evaluate what that calibration supports as far as what the model is used for. And so the groundwater level calibration in the municipal pumping area closer to the coast supports evaluating seawater intrusion by comparing groundwater levels to groundwater level proxies. It supports evaluating groundwater level response in that coastal area, in the municipal pumping area. The limitations include evaluating pumping response in the DEF aquifer unit because of the structure of the model. Evaluation of inland response to specific management actions. So once you get inland, you can't say that there's a specific management action that will result in a specific response inland. And there's a limited area where we are able to quantify stream aquifer interactions with the model. And that's where we have data and have been able to calibrate to. So any questions on that? I'm going to go ahead and unmute all, because I think it was on our end.
Could you explain the limitation of the DEF unit again?
Yes. So the model combines the DEF unit with the F unit as a model layer 3, and so that results in the DEF unit being simulated as unconfined for a lot of it, even though it does behave confined because it's overlain by the F unit. So there are areas of the DEF unit where the model does not calibrate well. Mark?
Sorry, previous slides, one of the limitations was the DEF unit, but the other limitation was the, sorry, go back, trying to remember, but that's the loss. The evaluation of inland response to energy issues. So the DEF unit obviously is only part of the whole basin. But is that second one across the whole, inland obviously being inland, but the whole basin inland or certain areas?
I think it's more in the Prism areas. We do have more wells in the deeper Prism areas. We have more wells in the Prism F unit where we can evaluate the calibration and simulate the trends, such as the Cox Raw field area. That we have data in that area. But once we get further to the west and deeper Prism, we don't have much data to calibrate to, and definitely don't know what the response would be. Keith?
Did you calculate the model parameters manually by humans doing that, or did you use some automation?
We mostly did it manually. We also used calibration software to, I guess on the watershed side, we did do more with the calibration software because it runs things, the watershed, you're able to run the watershed portion of it quicker to calibrate to the data. And that tries to minimize tries to maximize the fit between observations and simulations. And we use software called PEST to do that, and just parameter estimation software basically. And and we used some of it on the groundwater side as well, but it was more manual to try to match the data because of the model run times. It's hard to run the model software, which requires many runs in sequence. So it was really the idea of this is where we want to match better and then manually calibrate.
On the stream flow, we've had many discussions about that, but it looked like most of the stream flow calculations are really based on PRMS rather than the groundwater part of the model.
Yes.
So that's where the interflow is in the PRMS.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it seemed like it bottomed out, that there was something in there that, for instance, kept Soquel Creek from going below 1 CFS, that when it got down, then your calibration curve sort of just flattened out, and it wouldn't produce any flow less than 1 CFS, which seems like some kind of artifact in there or something.
Lower stream flows,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is why we're not able to get those lower stream flow rate. That's bottom.
I guess I'm wondering, is there anything we can do, like more detailed work? I mean, in the alluvial area, you're really looking at the groundwater levels rather than actual flow.
Yeah.
Is there anything we can do about the flow, or we're just sort of stuck with, like, we do another 100,000 at it?
Easy there.
Yeah, more money.
Or have we pretty much done what we can do with it?
I think we've done what we can do with it. There may be things we can look and try to figure out why it bottoms out. But I want to get to continue to get that flow coming down. To get a lower amount, I just don't think it's going to be get that accurate and precise.
Okay.
Becky?
I have a few questions. Becky Steinbrunner. Let me just make sure I understood what you said, that on the whole stream flow and the groundwater in the model are not that well connected? Groundwater data is not that well connected?
So they are, there is a connection between the stream flow and the groundwater. Groundwater levels are high enough for most of that SoCal system and going in that system that there's a connection between the stream flow and the streams and the groundwater. But the amount of flow between them is relatively low to be able to simulate what we're observing downstream.
I see. Okay.
So then there are other areas, the Corralitos area where and Valencia Creek, where the disconnect, the groundwater levels are lower in the stream bed, and there is no connection between, no direct connection between the streams and the groundwater.
And that holds true throughout the seasons?
There are times when things change, but generally for those systems, it's pretty consistent through the season.
Thank you. I have another question. Where on the creeks did you sample? Up in the upper elevations, at the mouth of the creek? Where did you take the samples?
So the stream flow gauges, so the stream flow gauges with the most amount of data are in the lower watersheds, so Soquel Creek near the Soquel Dry Bridge is a USGS gauge, and Corralitos Creek as it exits the model, how we define the model domain to get model results at that location to compare two observations of stream flow in Corralitos Creek. There are other gauges upstream that we also calibrate to, but the data do not cover as much of the time period.
But they are
upper SoCal watershed mostly.
they are actual sites that do exist and have historic information that you've plugged into?
Yeah, so some of them are historic and have not been, I mean, most of these upper ones that are part of the U.S. Geological Survey are no longer active. These two that are Soquel Creek Water District gauges, they are still monitored.
Thank you.
And then the shallow water levels are more down to this gauge on Soquel Creek.
Okay. Can I ask a couple more questions, or do you need to move along?
I think a couple more questions.
Okay, thank you. What time of year did you take the sampling data for the groundwater level data? Was that over a period of seasons or in summer, late fall?
Yeah, so they're generally, most of these, some depends on the well, but it does cover through, overall it covers all the seasons. So Soquel Creek Water District, which has a big part of the monitoring system, has generally taken the water levels either semi-annually or quarterly.
Quarterly?
Yeah, and then they have loggers now which record water levels continuously, and then those data are downloaded quarterly. But historically, it goes back, and it's been sent, those monitoring wells, those groundwater levels have been monitored at least semi-annually and in other places quarterly.
Okay, thank you. I guess my last question is, how reliable is this information for the purposes of this group trying to create a plan? How reliable, what confidence level do you have in this information?
So, given the limitations, understanding what the model can be used for and what it can't be used for, I think the calibration supports evaluating the projects and management actions where they're most likely to occur, and that's closer to the coast, because the main concern is seawater intrusion and preventing seawater intrusion over the long term. So I think for that purpose, it is at an appropriate level of calibration.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Is there somebody on the phone who's trying to jump in?
This is Sarah. I had a question. So I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. So the only way you're able to reproduce those downstream flows is through the use of interflow? Is that correct?
Yes, so that is how we were able to simulate the downstream flow, was with interflow.
Okay. And I was wondering how, you mentioned sensitivity analyses earlier and how sensitive those flows are to the regression curves that you calibrate for.
Yeah, so they're very sensitive. Being able to simulate those are very sensitive to the overall connection between groundwater and stream flow. In my earlier answer, I'd say that it is connected. The streams are connected to groundwater, but how much flow flows from groundwater to streams flattens out the curves even more than what we're observing, and we're not able to have that continuous recession throughout the season. And so to have that continuous recession, we needed it to be fed by interflow to simulate that. And so that could be a combination of many different actual physical processes, but in the model, it was best represented by interflow.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, sure.
I have what do you call it, a concept, theoretical, just a hypothetical question, I guess, that you could either recharge aquifers gradually so that they kind of asymptotically approach sustainable levels, or on the other end of the spectrum, you could just, by some means, charge them up robustly and suddenly, hit sustainable levels, and then change your regimen and just not need a whole lot of water coming in anymore, and just ride at sustainable levels with relatively little water. In the second event, or in the second case, how much water would it take us to get to sustainable levels from Live Oak to La Selva? Presumably, we'd only need a wedge of water somewhere near the coast. How many acre feet are we talking about to just hit it once and then we're at the sort of a steady state after that?
Yeah, so I can only answer the question based off of projects that have been evaluated to date in, for example, the model one's done for Pierce Water Soquel EAR. It did not show that you could just provide a certain amount of water and then stop and maintain sustainability. That you would have to continue it over time. So that, you know, the amount of water that project provided did raise groundwater levels in many monitoring wells to what would be sustainable levels, but it did, once we simulated that it would stop after 20 years and then it dropped back below. So it would need to continue.
So it'd take 20 years of 1,500 acre feet a year, 500,000 gallons a year.
Well, those runs show that it got up there much faster than 20 years.
Oh.
Yeah, but you need to continue it. You can't stop after 20 years.
Right, I understand, but it's at a different slope than it was for the first time period. And so, what was the time period at which you hit the knee in the curve, as it were?
Well,
at 1,500 acre feet a year. how many years does that need when you can change the feed and maintain sustainable levels?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking?
There's two slopes. One slope is to fill up the aquifer once, so to speak. And then after that, there's sustaining the aquifer, which takes some extra flow, but not as much as the flow rate in the years when you're trying to charge up the aquifer in the first place to reach sustainable level.
Yeah, so I haven't tested what a different flow. We haven't modeled any different flow, a change in flow.
So you don't know how many years it would take to charge up to sustainable levels using 1,500 acre-feet a year?
Well, that's been simulated.
Okay.
And those model results show that it's much less than 20 years, less than 10 years.
Less than 10 years?
Yeah. But there needs to be continued over time. Is what those model results show.
So, are you saying it's about 10 years, or are you saying it might be as little as 5? What's your best number your best guess for that date at which you hit that need?
Well, those results show that groundwater levels, I mean, not throughout the basin, but groundwater levels in a number of monitoring wells reach sustainability in 5 to 10 years, I think. It's a short amount of time, but you need to continue recharging over time. You can't just say we're here.
Sure, rainfall is unpredictable, so I would expect a range like you're saying, 5 to 10 years. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Hello.
Yes, Andres?
Yeah. When you were talking about limitations, I would like to know what are your comments about the stream flow routing method from GS Flow, because I saw some other projects. This simplify the stream flow routing method sometimes create some limitations with the results. For example, base flow, when you cannot really differentiate between the groundwater and, for example, some runoff that is happening during the season. So I'd like to know if you have something about it.
Could you repeat the question?
1 second. I'd like to know if you have some comments about the stream flow routing method from GS Flow.
Yeah.
And if it is probably related to some of the limitations that you can see for low flow, because at some point this simplified method, routing method sometimes, for example, doesn't model some effects that happen in the real life.
Right. So I think that's a very possible explanation for some of the limitations. Is that the stream flow, we're basically going along approximately 800-foot segments from reach to reach, and basically transmitting the flow downstream through those reach cells, and being able to say what the flow is within that length of 800 or so feet. We're not able to simulate it.
Yeah, actually, I also was talking about the routing method. This, I think, the cinematic routing method at GS Flow. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, are you talking about the routing of the runoff, or the routing within the stream stream package.
Yeah, between, the stream package. Mhm.
Yeah. So, so the routing within the stream package is, I don't think is a so sophisticated surface water routing. It's mostly a mass balance of routing the flow downstream.
Okay, I was just trying to figure it out, potential future improvement, when you cannot, for example, you cannot show a figure when you cannot simulate very well we can simulate at all slow flows.
Yeah.
So I was trying to figure it out, what that can be a potential improvement in the method.
Yeah, I think any ideas on that would be appreciated if there is interest.
Thank you.
I've got another question.
Is it related to model calibration?
I'm not sure. It depends on your answer, I suppose.
Why don't you ask?
We
I
made
apologize for my naivete about the matter, but it is central to the effort
Yes.
that we're assembling for. And it's a pretty simple question. There's two classes of ways, at least, to recharge the aquifer. One is using, say, the pure water, so
Okay, so it sounds like you're talking
injection.
about projects. So we'll talk about how we're evaluating projects a little later. I've only got 35 minutes left, so I do want to make sure we get through
Yeah,
this.
let's keep rolling, and then maybe there'll be a spot for you later in the next.
Okay, it's an important question.
These are all important questions, but I do want to make sure we cover the material for this enrichment session.
All right.
And we do talk about how we evaluate projects. And I think that would be a better place for it.
Well, that's different topics than what I was going to ask, but go ahead.
So model output includes the groundwater levels that we calibrate to and the water budget. And so the groundwater budget includes model calculated outputs, and that includes what the deep percolation of rainfall includes, the subsurface inflows and outflows, stream bed percolation, groundwater flow to creeks, and the change of groundwater to storage. The rest of the water budget components include data inputs such as pumping and return flow. So that's all part of the water budget. But because we do have simulate a barrier to flow with South fault across the Mid-County Basin, we look at the water budget separately between the north of Baptist Fault and south of the Baptist Fault. And the south has the majority of the basin pumping and is more informative for evaluating seawater intrusion. So, so we focus on, for evaluating sustainability, the water budget south of Baptist Fault. The water budget south of Baptist Fault includes inflows, which include several different kinds of recharge components, including aerial recharge, which comes through the UZF package through the unsaturated zone, which is a salmon color. Then the blue bars, which are flow from the stream alluvium, so the source of that water is from the streams. And then the green bar, which is through the terrace deposits, which overlie areas closer to the coast. Then there's some inflow from Pajaro Valley, and as well as from north of Baptist Fault. Most of the outflows are by pumping, and then there is a net outflow offshore. But this net outflow offshore might not be enough to prevent seawater intrusion in specific locations. And so what's not a bar, but a line, is the difference between the inflows and outflows, which is the change of groundwater in storage. So where that's negative, it means the outflows are greater than the inflows, and groundwater levels on the whole are decreasing. and where it's positive, the inflows are greater than outflows, the groundwater levels as a whole are increasing. So offshore outflows, as I mentioned, it's net on the whole is flow offshore. So this is, because we look at everything from the perspective of the basin, and the basin borders at the coast, flow out of the basin is negative. So I've switched the axes here so that the higher numbers here are offshore outflows. So for the most part, there's offshore outflows. That doesn't mean that that's enough to prevent seawater intrusion. And you can see in specific aquifer units, there is inflow from offshore, indicating that risk of seawater intrusion. So specifically, these purple bars representing the Prisma A unit have mostly had inflow from offshore over time, showing that seawater intrusion. So the overall water budget for this isn't as important as specific areas and specific layers where seawater intrusion could be indicated for risk. Similarly, change of groundwater storage. Just looking at south of that plus fault, there are certain layers which have had a cumulative increase in groundwater storage, groundwater levels increasing over time. And this is our lowest layer, which includes the TU unit, which is yellow, where there hasn't been much pumping over time. But if you look at specific aquifer units, there has been a decrease in groundwater storage. Again, the Prisma A unit, the Prisma, has been had a decrease in groundwater storage in time. And this dashed line is the Prisma layers together. So it's really important in my mind, especially in this basin where you're looking, and especially under sigma, where you're looking at specific sustainability indicators, not to look at the full water budget, but look at specific parts of the water budget which indicate issues with sustainability. Any questions on that? Becky.
I do. Thank you, Becky Steinbruner. I wanted to know if you could explain a little bit more that last slide in terms of what it really means. You know, I'm seeing the layer 7 decreasing while the layer 9 is increasing. Can you explain that a little more? I'm not quite sure what I'm seeing here.
Yeah, so layer 7 is where a lot of the pumping has occurred, and a lot of that is because it is a more productive aquifer unit, and because it has been pumped over time, the groundwater and storage is decreasing over time. And that represents groundwater levels dropping on whole over time. And those dropping groundwater levels have resulted in a risk of seawater intrusion into that aquifer unit.
But the purple, like the groundwater level has actually come up.
Yeah, so
am I reading that wrong?
You are not reading that incorrectly in that this cumulative change has, this reduction over time has decreased over time, so it's improved over time, but there still is this historical deficit that hasn't come back to the zero line over time.
Do we have information earlier than 1987?
We do have information, some information earlier than 1987, but we don't have information that we can model. We also don't have much groundwater levels we can calibrate to before 1985. And so for these groundwater budget plots that started in 1987, because the model takes a couple of years to ramp up, so the information starts making sense after a couple of years.
Okay, thank you.
But there's a big increase in storage in the TU.
Well, it's in the layer 9 of the groundwater model, and so what is actually the pump TU area is much smaller than our full layer 9. So because there isn't much pumping throughout that whole area, storage has to be.
Because we've actually seen water levels drop in the TU, it seems.
in the recent times when
Yeah.
pumping has increased, but over this time period, we don't really know. And so having not simulated groundwater pumping for that early time, the groundwater storage has it's built up in the
We
model.
weren't pumping it that much.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, how does this react with future pumping? Maybe
More relevant.
it'll be more relevant for how much some pumping can affect whether storage stays, groundwater storage stays high, or whether that's depleted relatively quickly.
Cameron, this graph is from 1987 to 2015, correct?
Right.
So that's the model period that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's the calibration period where we've calibrated to observation data.
That was my question, and it may not be about calibration, so if you answer it later, it's fine. But obviously, there's a clear trend though, right? So do we know if we went to 2020 or 2025, if we kept the trend, does that then put layer 7 into the positive?
So we can evaluate that, and we've looked at what reduced pumping is over time, but I don't know the exact results of that for layer 7.
I have one more question.
Yes.
On the offshore flow, that graph, it showed that it looked like offshore flow was pretty much constant except in 1990 in that area, maybe 87. Can you explain that a little bit? Can you talk about that? What was going on then that made the offshore flow reduce, and yet it seems to be, kind of recovering?
Well, so specific to layer 7 where the offshore flow is coming onshore?
Well, I'm just, yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, so there was greater pumping in the Prisma A unit during this time period, which led to more onshore flow. I think it's important to recognize that onshore flow is definitely representative of seawater intrusion risk, but just because you have offshore flow, doesn't mean you're eliminating seawater intrusion risk. You need a certain amount of offshore flow to prevent seawater intrusion. So these amounts, which are lower amounts of onshore flow or small amounts of offshore flow in the Prism A unit, this is definitely not enough to prevent seawater intrusion into those A units on the whole, and this may not be enough as well, the small amounts.
What do you need to prevent seawater intrusion? What levels do you need?
So we need to have the amount of flow that achieves the groundwater levels that have been estimated to prevent seawater intrusion. So those have been proposed as groundwater level proxies. That's why, to evaluate project results, we really want to look at the groundwater level results and whether groundwater level results are achieved. And that's what we'll look at in the next section.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Any questions from the phone? So the purpose of the model, as we circle back to why we have the model, is to evaluate projects for achieving sustainability. And one of the things we want to do is to have model simulations that are consistent across each other for different baseline assumptions, and so that we can evaluate the project specifically. And so there are some baseline assumptions we are making for the future conditions that we're going forward with evaluating projects. And so I did want to cover what we're doing for those. So projected land use and non-municipal groundwater demand. We're not simulating any change in land use over time. We're going to assume that land use is similar to what it's been. There is an increase in assumed non-municipal water use, in our historical period, we have a decrease in non-municipal water use over recent years during the drought conditions when conservation has been accomplished to a great deal in this basin, but we assume a bounce back to the pre-drought usage estimate. And then after that, we assume non-municipal domestic use increases based off of the estimates of population growth. So for the first 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, it's a higher growth to let's assume for the post 2035 time period. And then for irrigation, either institutional irrigation or agricultural irrigation, assuming the same crop use and therefore the same crop demand, so it depends on what the climate is over time and what the water demand for those crops will be over time. So groundwater demand projections, we have to assume something for groundwater demand projections. Groundwater demand projections that we have been working with, have been available, been for Central Water District going back to a pre-drought average of what that pumping was for municipal pumping. For Soquel Creek Water District, the Urban Water Management Plan assumes a bounce back in the demand after the recent drought, but over the long term, it's decrease in groundwater demand. The city of Santa Cruz uses mostly surface water for its water supply, and so its groundwater pumping is outlined in its cooperative agreement with Soquel Creek Water District for how much they expect to pump over in non-critically dry years and how much more they would pump in critically dry years when their surface water supply drops. So these demand projections have been recognized since they've come out that they may be underestimated related to new laws facilitating accessory dwelling units, possibility of land use changes. And so any possibility of higher demand would increase the size of the project or action to meet sustainability because there's more demand to be met. So for evaluating groundwater sustainability, we have moved forward with simulating a higher groundwater demand over time, and that is mostly by assuming that Soquel Creek Water District groundwater demand is stable, it doesn't drop off over time. And we also, to isolate the effect of projects, we assume no surface water transfer accompanying any other project. So if we were to evaluate a surface water transfer, it would be specifically a project and management action that includes surface water transfer. Other baseline assumptions include climate change modeling. The GSP regulations require evaluating over a 50-year time period that includes climate change. The Department of Water Resources did put out guidance for for methods to evaluate climate change, including data sets. But an important part to recognize is that that guidance made clear that local considerations and decisions could lead to the use of different approaches and methods. And we are using a different approach and method than the DWR guidance. And that different approach and method was recommended by the Model Technical Advisory Committee. And so it's an approach called the Catalog Climate Approach, and that's what we're using for planning in the Mid-County Basin. So Catalog Climate Approach basically uses historical data instead of global circulation models. It was suggested by UC Santa Cruz Professor Andy Fisher, a member of the Technical Advisory Committee. It's similar to a proposal of an approach followed by Metropolitan Water District in Southern California. And what it does is it selects years from the history to form a catalog here. So it's based off of actual data, but it's selected to warmer years in the history are selected to represent the expected increases in temperature related to climate change. And that data is from the same climate stations that we use for our model input to our model. So basically, if you look at temperature over time at the Santa Cruz Co-op station, the red years are the warmer years, and those are preferentially selected for our catalog plan. We do include some of the cooler years to provide some variation in the climate that we simulate. So those warm years that are selected include both dry years and wet years. If you look at some of these red and orange years are the warm years. So the red years are the warm and dry years, and then the orange years are the warmer and wet years. So it includes both dry and wet years. And so what we end up with is a climate simulation that includes mostly warm years, and because a number of those warm years, the warmest years were dry years, many dry years. And so that results in temperatures that increase from historical average about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit at the Santa Cruz Co-op station, and decreases precipitation about 3 inches or 10%. So and that precipitation decrease and the temperature, the temperature increase does result in an overall model increase in evapotranspiration that's calculated of about 6%. So comparing it to the data sets that the state uses global circulation models, the most recent version of the global circulation models. And those global circulation models, because they assume higher emissions than we've had in history, end up with higher temperatures than the catalog climate, which is based off of the historical record. So this temperature, this y-axis shows the increase in temperature, and these show the range in temperatures that are simulated on average by the different global circulation models used by the ensemble used by the state. We compare it to a range used for the catalog climate, and for the most part, these global circulation models do have higher temperatures, less of a decrease in precipitation than our catalog climate. So these global circulation models, in many cases, show increased precipitation for this area. And so for sustainability planning, one thing we do want to do is...
I have a question, and please clarify, maybe I didn't hear it properly, but when you were talking about the acre feet per year required, did I hear you say that it assumes there would be no surface water transfers?
Well, surface water transfers can be evaluated with the model, but for evaluating any project, we assume no surface water transfer going forward.
So it's not being evaluated, is that what you're saying?
No. What I'm saying is it's not assumed to occur alongside any other project. So surface water transfer can be evaluated with the model, but we're not assuming it as something that continues in all of our projects on top of it.
It's what you've been doing. You've been evaluating one project at a time, essentially,
Right.
rather than a combination of projects. Including surface water would be combining two different things. So
I see.
the first step was to evaluate all the projects individually, and then we're going to do more work where we look at combinations of projects.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Cameron, was our using 2.
The previous estimates from 2010, which were lower than the 2.3. We originally started with 1.5 feet, and their guidance was consistent with that. Because I think their guidance came
Yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question about, you said that this model uses the Southern California Metropolitan Climate Change Model. Is that the same one as the city of Santa Cruz is using, or is it a different model?
It is different. So what City of Santa Cruz used in the WASAC, Water Supply Advisory Committee process was one specific global circulation model from the Seaman 3 ensemble, which is the older version of the ensemble. And that's what that planning was done on. And so